there's been a whole range of things that have particularly grown in the last 5 or 6 years. One has been the introduction in various institutions of quite censorious policies relating to views on transgender or transsexual identity, in particular trying to declare invalid the view of so-called gender-critical people, those who believe there's a fundamental difference between biological sex and gender identity, and that various arenas or spaces, whether they be changing rooms, prisons, refuges, sports games or so on, should be determined and divided up according to biological sex rather than according to self-declared or identified gender. But there are institutions who've taken disciplinary actions against individuals who have held those gender-critical views, or otherwise there have been cases of students sometimes trying to silence or harass those who have not. The most notorious case being that of the philosopher Kathleen Stock, who was formerly a professor at the University of Sussex, and I would say was essentially hounded out by what I would characterize as mobbing behavior by large numbers of students, organizing vigils and major protests against her practically every day, some of which were backed, according to her, by some of her colleagues as well. And it just made her life impossible to function there. So after she'd published this, what I think is an excellent book, Material Girls, which looks at the whole development of various perspectives on gender identity, but still takes a critical view of some of that tradition. And this is an area my colleague in LUCAF, Alice Sullivan, has been very active and published extensively. Then there's also the issue of so-called decolonizing the curriculum, which is as a slogan which has become official policy at quite a number of UK universities. There's a new book on this by sociologist Doug Stokes, just called Against Decolonization, which I cannot recommend enough for a very thorough chronicling and sober analysis of its implications. What decolonizing the curriculum means often in practice is not simply broadening curricula to incorporate a wider range of global concerns, culture, history, scientific innovation, and so on. Those are all things I'd very much support. But it's rooted in a very Manichaean West versus the rest dichotomy, which views almost anything Western as irredeemably colonial, and ignoring the extremely varied extent to which various parts of the West at different times in history were involved in the business of global empire building. Certainly, the complex questions of how this related to other phenomena in those society, including culture and thought, and for that matter also ignoring the non-Western empires, some of which colonized parts of the West as well. But this movement, I think, has been quite frequently informed by other developments in critical race theory, which essentially posits irreconcilable divides between groups defined in racial terms, and as such a state of almost permanent hostility, arguing often that practically all white people are racist almost by definition. And perhaps what I think is the most worrying one, standpoint epistemology, which at its starkest valorizes knowledge not so much by its individual coherence, its argument, its cogency, but by the identity of its authors. And this is something that Doug Stokes looks at in great detail very well. From those perspectives, decolonization often amounts to a radical attack on most forms of Western knowledge, culture, science, and so on, and on the other hand can make mandatory, rather uncritical use of sources, texts from elsewhere in the world without really engaging into critical questions of their value. Sometimes, say, very traditional but rather outmoded modes of belief, including to do with medicine and things associated with certain communities, can be regarded as on a par with modern global science and mathematics. And in my own field of music, the arguments have been used often to try and literally drive classical music out of the curriculum, viewed as little more than expression of a colonial perspective.